I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room surrounded by executives in tailored suits and a client worth millions when my phone buzzed. In 5 minutes, I accepted a job offer. In 10 minutes, I signed it, and before the meeting could even end, I resigned while everyone who mattered was watching. That single decision didn't just end my job. It quietly started the collapse of the company that spent years breaking me down. Asterisk if you've ever been overworked, underpaid, and made to feel replaceable while carrying an entire company on your back, you're going to feel this one deep. Hit like, subscribe, and settle in because this revenge wasn't loud, it wasn't illegal, and it was devastating. Now let me take you back to how it all started. I used to believe hard work spoke for itself. I believed if I stayed late, fixed impossible problems, and protected clients from disasters they never even knew about, someone would eventually notice. I was wrong. I worked at a digital agency that loved calling itself a national leader. Awards on the walls, big-name clients, polished LinkedIn posts about culture and innovation. Behind the scenes, it ran on exhaustion and I was the engine. I was responsible for maintenance and uptime for mission-critical software used by our core clients. Not side projects, not experiments, systems that could not go down. Systems where seconds of downtime meant six-figure losses. And because I was good at it, too good, I also ran the team that handled the same for secondary clients. Every alert, every escalation, every nightmare scenario eventually landed on my desk. My phone never really stopped vibrating. Even on weekends, even on holidays. I learned to sleep lightly, half-dressed, because outages don't care if it's 3 a.m. year after year. I asked for raises. Not extravagant ones, just fair. Just something that reflected the responsibility I carried and the stress that was slowly eating me alive. Year after year, the answer came wrapped in corporate language. This isn't the right time, the budget is tight, let's revisit next quarter. Sometimes they'd toss me a pay increase so small it felt insulting. The kind you calculate once and never mention again because acknowledging it would hurt more. I also begged for help. A partner, a backup, someone who could share the load so I didn't feel like the entire system would collapse if I caught the flu. They smiled. They nodded. They told me they didn't see the need. After all, everything was still running, right? The servers were up. The clients were happy. The dashboards were green. What they never measured was me. The dark circles under my eyes, the constant tightness in my chest, the way my hands shook after too much caffeine and too little sleep. Every 6 months, like clockwork, came the performance review. A small room, a manager who never quite met my eyes, slides about exceeding expectations, praises that sounded impressive but meant nothing without action. And then I'd bring it up again. My workload, my mental health, my salary falling behind market rates. I learned to phrase it calmly, professionally, because emotional women are dismissed faster. And every time, I left with the same hollow feeling. In my stomach, nothing would change. What they didn't know what made all the difference was that I had quietly started looking elsewhere. Not out of spite, out of survival. And when a competitor reached out, offering better pay, better boundaries, and an actual team structure, it felt unreal. Like someone had finally read my resume instead of exploiting it. I didn't tell anyone. I kept showing up. I kept the lights on. I waited. Then came the review that broke something in me. Same room, same tone, same denial. I explained, again, that I was burning out, that I couldn't keep doing this alone. That my finances were tight because my pay had stagnated while my responsibilities exploded. My manager sighed, not in concern, but in irritation. HR nodded sympathetically, the way people do when they've already decided. The answer was no, no raise. No additional support. Maybe next cycle. I remember sitting there, smiling politely, while something inside me went very quiet, not angry, not sad, just done. A week later, we had an in-person meeting scheduled with our second biggest client, contract renewal, SLA. Discussions, high stakes, because I was responsible for maintenance and uptime, I was required to attend. I wore my best blazer, put on the professional mask. Walked into the conference room with its glass walls and long polished table. The client team sat across from us. Our executives lined my side like a row of confident chess pieces. As the meeting droned on, talking numbers and uptime percentages, my phone vibrated in my lap. A message from the competitor. The formal offer: better pay, clear hours, shared responsibility, respect. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I reread the email, my thumb hovering. My manager noticed. I saw his eyes flick down, then back up, sharp and annoyed. In that moment, something clicked. All those years of being told to wait, to be patient, to be grateful. I realized no one was coming to save me, so I did it myself. Under the table, I replied, "I accept." 5 minutes later, the contract arrived. 10 minutes later, I signed it. My hands were steady. My mind was clear. I forwarded my resignation email to HR, my manager, and every executive who mattered. What they didn't realize, what made it unforgettable, was that every single one of them was sitting in that room with me. One by one, their phones buzzed. The meeting stopped mid-sentence. Faces went red. Someone cleared their throat. The room filled with a thick, panicked silence. The client looked confused as executives started checking their screens. Then my manager stood up abruptly and asked for a pause. I was escorted out like a liability. In the hallway, they demanded answers. What was I doing? Was this a joke? Did I understand the consequences? I explained calmly. Years of denial. No support. Another offer I couldn't refuse. Utter disbelief stared back at me. Not guilt. Not regret. Shock. As if the idea that I could leave had never crossed their minds. I walked out that day lighter than I had felt in years, and this was only the beginning. The funny thing about walking out of that building wasn't the adrenaline or the fear, it was the silence. No alerts buzzing on my phone, no Slack pings asking if I was awake. No executives just checking in. For the first time in years, my nervous system didn't feel like it was bracing for impact. I went home, kicked off my shoes, and sat on the edge of my bed just breathing, letting it sink in. I had finally chosen myself, and there was no undo button. The next morning, my inbox was a war zone. Messages from HR asking to talk things through. My manager's tone had shifted completely. No irritation now, just urgency dressed up as concern. We didn't realize how bad it was. Let's revisit compensation. Maybe we can fast-track support. It would have been laughable if it hadn't been so insulting. Years of calm, documented pleas had meant nothing. 10 minutes of decisive action had them scrambling. I declined every meeting, politely, professionally, firmly. I wasn't angry anymore, I was resolved. That scared them more than any outburst ever could. People like that don't fear emotion, they fear control slipping through their fingers. I worked my notice period exactly as my contract required. No overtime, no heroic saves, no covering gaps that management had refused to fill. I documented processes, handed over access, and answered questions once. When someone asked the same thing again, I directed them to the documentation. It wasn't revenge, it was boundaries. And it exposed something ugly very quickly. They didn't actually understand the systems I'd built. They'd never needed to. As long as things worked, my work was invisible. But now, without me constantly compensating for poor decisions and understaffing, cracks began to show. Missed alerts, slow responses, confusion during incidents that would have once been handled quietly before clients even noticed. The second biggest client, the one from that meeting, renewed their contract. That year, on paper, everything looked fine. But behind closed doors, panic had set in. I heard it through former teammates who still trusted me, emergency meetings, consultants brought in at premium rates, executives asking questions they should have learned the answers 2 years ago. The uptime dashboard was still green, but it flickered more often than anyone liked. Meanwhile, my new job felt surreal. My first week, my new manager asked me to log off on time. I laughed, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. They had redundancy, real teams, escalation paths that didn't end with one exhausted woman staring at her phone in the dark. When something broke, it was handled collectively. When I spoke, people listened. I wasn't superhuman there, and that was the point. Months passed, then a year. That's when the client left. Not dramatically. Not with a lawsuit or a public statement. Just a quiet notice that they wouldn't be renewing. The official reason: inability to consistently meet the 99.999% uptime SLA. A single decimal point that most people would gloss over, but that point represented trust. Trust I had spent years protecting with my health, my time, my sanity. Without me compensating for every structural weakness, the company couldn't keep its promises. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I sat with the knowledge that the thing they refused to invest in, the person they saw as endlessly replaceable, had been holding everything together. And when they lost that, they lost more than a contract. They lost credibility. Soon after, the layoffs started. Harsh market. They said, strategic downscaling. The same language they'd used to deny my raises now explained their decline. Former colleagues reached out, quietly at first, then more openly. Some apologized for not speaking up. Some asked how I'd had the courage to leave. I told them the truth. I was more afraid of staying. What surprised me most wasn't their downfall, it was how little it consumed me. My career was accelerating. Projects were exciting. My evenings were mine again. I slept through the night. The revenge wasn't watching them struggle. It was realizing I was no longer tied to their failure. But there was one last moment, the kind that lingers. An industry event. A crowded room. I spotted an executive from my old company across the floor. He saw me too, hesitated, then nodded, tight-lipped. No apology, no conversation. Just the unspoken acknowledgement that he knew. He knew what they'd lost. He knew they'd miscalculated. And he knew I'd won without ever raising my voice. Sometimes, the most devastating revenge isn't destruction. It's absence. After the client left, something shifted. Not loudly, not publicly, but inside that company. Panic stopped being temporary and started becoming permanent. I didn't see it on LinkedIn posts or press releases. I heard it in whispers, late-night messages, and voices that sounded smaller than I remembered. Former teammates reached out one by one. At first, it was casual. Hey, random question. Then it became honest. Can I ask you something, without it getting back to anyone? That's when I started to understand the scale of what had happened after I left. They had replaced me, on paper. 3 people. 1 senior hire with an impressive resume, and 2 juniors to share the load. Management congratulated themselves for finally fixing the single point of failure problem. But what they didn't understand was that the problem was never me. The problem was that the system relied on unpaid emotional labor, institutional knowledge stored in one human brain, and silent sacrifices no spreadsheet could capture. The new team struggled immediately. Not because they were incompetent, but because they were set up to fail. The systems were fragile in ways only experience teaches you to feel. Alerts that technically weren't critical but always turned into disasters if ignored. Clients who needed reassurance before they even realized there was an issue. Shortcuts I'd built over years to prevent cascading failures. None of that was in the documentation. It couldn't be. So incidents dragged on longer. Downtime windows stretched. Clients noticed hesitation. And executives used to problems vanishing before meetings started, sitting through them in real time. That's when the tone changed. I got the calls. Not officially, not through HR. Direct messages. Can you explain why this keeps happening? Do you remember how you handled this edge case? One exec even said, we didn't realize how much was in your head, as if that absolved them. As if realization was the same as accountability. I answered once. Briefly, politely, then I stopped. Not out of spite, but because I finally understood something important. Every free answer delayed their reckoning. Every favor softened the lesson they desperately needed to learn. They tried guilt next. A former manager told me people were overwhelmed, that morale was low, that my departure had really affected the team. I listened quietly and then asked a simple question. Did anything change when I asked for help? Silence, long enough to feel uncomfortable, then excuses, then deflection, then the call ended. What haunted them wasn't just operational failure, it was narrative collapse. For years, The story had been that I was lucky to be there, that raises were earned slowly, that support wasn't necessary. Now, without me, the story didn't hold. The metrics told a different truth. Clients noticed, auditors noticed, competitors noticed. And I noticed how free I felt watching it all. From a distance. At my new job, my confidence grew in a way I hadn't expected. Not louder, not arrogant, quieter, rooted. I started contributing ideas instead of just fixing fires. I led projects without carrying the weight of the entire infrastructure on my shoulders. When something went wrong, no one looked at me like it was my fault by default. They asked what we could improve together. That contrast hurt at first. It made me mourn the version of myself I could have been years earlier if I hadn't been conditioned to accept neglect as normal. But grief turned into clarity. And clarity is powerful. Then came the meeting I wasn't supposed to hear about. An internal review. Post-mortem style, leadership analyzing what went wrong. My name came up more than once, not angrily, not even resentfully, with something worse, regret. They finally connected the dots. The denied raises, the ignored burnout, the risk. They'd convinced themselves wasn't real because I kept absorbing it. But here's the part they never said out loud. Apologizing wouldn't fix it. They couldn't undo the damage. They couldn't call me back without admitting publicly that they'd built their success on exploitation. And companies like that would rather shrink quietly than confess loudly. I didn't need their apology anyway. The real payoff wasn't their struggle. It was the moment I realized I no longer needed validation from people who only valued me when I was convenient. I stopped checking their updates, stopped asking former coworkers for news. My life had expanded beyond the walls that once defined it. Still, karma has a way of circling back gently, and then all at once, because just when I thought the story was over, I got an email. A familiar domain, a subject line that made my stomach flip. Exploring future collaboration. I smiled. When that email landed in my inbox, I didn't open it right away. I just stared at the subject line, letting the irony wash over me. Exploring future collaboration. Not an apology, not accountability, not even my name in the subject. Just corporate language carefully chosen to avoid admitting what they'd done or what they'd lost. A year earlier, I would have opened it immediately, heart racing. Desperate for some sign that I still mattered, but this time was different. This time, I made coffee. I sat by the window. I let myself feel calm first. Because whatever was inside that email, I was no longer at its mercy. When I finally opened it, it was exactly what I expected and worse. They praised my unique expertise. They acknowledged my deep system knowledge. They talked about unforeseen challenges since my departure. Not once did they mention denying my raises. Not once did they reference my burnout, my warnings, my exhaustion. The message ended with an invitation to discuss opportunities and a line about how they were open to flexible arrangements. Translation: they were bleeding, and they wanted my labor without my presence. I leaned back in my chair and laughed, not loudly, not bitterly. Just a quiet, disbelieving laugh at how predictable power becomes when it's threatened. Over the next few days, more messages followed. A calendar invite just to talk. A former executive liking my professional updates. A mutual contact, casually mentioning how things haven't been the same since I left. It was pressure without fingerprints, influence without accountability. The same tactics they'd always used, just aimed from a different angle. And here's the thing. They never understood. My revenge wasn't leaving. It was healing. At my new job, I had started to recognize just how abnormal my old reality had been. My body stopped flinching at notification sounds. I no longer woke up already tired. I had energy for friends again, for hobbies, for silence. The version of me they wanted back didn't exist anymore, and even if she did, I wouldn't sacrifice her again. So I replied, brief, professional, precise. I thanked them for reaching out. I acknowledged their kind words, and then I declined. No availability, no interest, no counteroffer. I wished them the best and ended the email. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. They escalated. A senior leader reached out directly. This time, someone who had sat in that conference room when I resigned. someone who had watched my hands stay steady while his world tilted. His message was warmer, almost personal. He talked about lessons learned, about doing things differently now, about how my return even in a limited capacity could help stabilize things. That word stuck with me, stabilize. Because for years, that's exactly what I had done. I stabilized chaos at my own expense. I absorbed stress so leadership could sleep. I protected relationships they barely understood. And they called it my job as if it didn't cost me pieces of myself I'm still reclaiming. I didn't respond immediately. Not because I was tempted, but because I wanted to be intentional. When I did reply, I was honest without being emotional. Told him that stability shouldn't come from one person sacrificing themselves, that if the company was struggling, it wasn't because I left, it was because they ignored every warning I gave while I stayed. I told him I was happy, fulfilled, and no longer interested in revisiting a chapter that nearly broke me. That time, there was no response, and that silence, that was the loudest admission of all. Not long after, the rumors became reality. More downsizing, projects shelved, clients re-evaluating partnerships. The company wasn't collapsing in flames, it was shrinking inward, quietly, like something finally exposed to the air after years of rot. Meanwhile, my career kept accelerating. I was invited into strategy meetings not as an afterthought, but as a voice that mattered. I mentored others and made sure no one under me ever felt as alone as I once had. When someone asked for help, we gave it. When someone showed signs of burnout, it was addressed, not documented and dismissed. One afternoon, during a casual conversation with my new director, he said something that hit me harder than any apology ever could. "We're glad you're here," he said, "but more importantly, we're glad you didn't burn yourself out to prove it." I excused myself to the restroom after that, sat in a stall, let a few quiet tears fall, not from pain, but from release, from realizing how deeply I'd normalized being mistreated just to feel valuable. That's when I understood the full shape of my revenge. It wasn't the lost client. It wasn't their shrinking influence. It wasn't the desperate emails. It was the fact that they could no longer reach me, not professionally, not emotionally, not psychologically. I had stepped out of their gravity, and they were left orbiting the absence of someone they'd taken for granted. And there was still one final moment left. One that tied everything together in a way I never could have planned. The final moment didn't arrive with drama. No confrontation, no raised voices, no cinematic showdown where someone finally admitted they were wrong. And that's exactly why it stayed with me. Because real power doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself when you realize you're no longer waiting for anything. It happened on an ordinary day. I was sitting at my desk at my new job, sunlight coming through the window. Coffee still warm beside me. I had just wrapped up a planning session where my input had shaped a long-term strategy, something I would never have been trusted with before, despite carrying far heavier responsibility. As the meeting ended, I felt that quiet satisfaction again, not adrenaline, not relief, belonging. Out of habit more than curiosity, I opened LinkedIn. And there it was, a post from my former company. Carefully worded, polished, neutral, the kind of announcement designed to look like a strategic decision rather than a consequence. They were refocusing operations, scaling down to meet market realities. Certain service offerings were being discontinued. Leadership thanked clients and employees for their support during a challenging period. No comments from executives I recognized. No celebratory tone, just a corporate goodbye disguised as optimism. I scrolled through the reactions. Former coworkers, industry peers, people asking vague questions that went unanswered, and then I noticed something else. The second biggest client, the one from that meeting, the one whose uptime I had protected with my life for years. Their logo was gone from the partner list. That was it. No announcement saying this is because we lost her. No article explaining how denying one overworked woman a raise had cost them millions. No public accountability. But I didn't need it. Because I knew. I closed the app and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. And for the first time, I let myself fully replay that meeting, the glass walls, The executive's confident expressions, the way my manager's face drained of color when he realized what I'd done. Back then, I thought that was the climax. The resignation, the shock. I was wrong. That moment wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a slow, inevitable truth they couldn't escape. They had built a critical part of their success on someone they refused to value. And when that person walked away calmly, professionally, without begging or burning bridges, everything they'd ignored finally demanded payment. What made it satisfying, what made it revenge was that I never had to become someone I didn't recognize. I didn't sabotage systems. I didn't expose secrets. I didn't humiliate anyone publicly. I simply stopped compensating for their neglect, and that was enough. Over time, former colleagues kept reaching out. Some had left. Some were trying to. Some were still there, exhausted, sounding exactly like I once did. When they asked how I knew it was time to go, I told them the truth. It's time when you realize your silence is more valuable to them than your voice. Because when a company listens only after you're gone, they were never listening to you. They were listening to the consequences. The biggest shift, though, wasn't external. It was internal. I stopped doubting my worth, stopped over-explaining, stopped equating suffering with loyalty. I learned that being dependable doesn't mean being disposable, that professionalism doesn't require self-destructs, that asking for fair compensation isn't entitlement, it's respect. And here's the part no one warns you about. Once you experience what it's like to be valued, you can never unsee how badly you were treated before. That knowledge is permanent. It changes how you move, how you speak, how you choose. Months later, I ran into my former manager at another industry event. Smaller crowd this time, quieter energy. He looked older, tired. When our eyes met, he smiled weakly and said my name, like it was a question. I smiled back, polite, calm, UNBOTHERED. We exchanged a few sentences about the industry, the weather, safe topics. He mentioned, almost involuntarily, how hard things had been, how fast everything changed, how no one could have predicted it. I nodded. Because I had predicted it. I had warned them. I had lived it. And then I excused myself, not out of anger, but because I no longer belonged in conversations where my pain had once been negotiable. As I walked away, I felt it again. That quiet power, the kind that doesn't need an audience, the kind that comes from knowing you survived something that tried to hollow you out and failed. The revenge wasn't watching them shrink. The revenge was growing beyond the version of myself they needed me to stay. Sometimes karma doesn't crash through the door. Sometimes it waits patiently for you to leave. And when you do, it lets people face the consequences of everything they refuse to fix. If this story hit close to home, if you've ever been undervalued, overworked, or made to feel replaceable, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and tell me in the comments, what's the moment you realized it was time to choose yourself? Subscribe for more deeply satisfying Reddit revenge stories, because the quiet ones hurt the most.